So we've now completed our leg assembly. All I've done since the last video is gone around and added a few more fillets onto the edges of the linkages, around the leg area and around the servo body. It's super easy in Fusion 360 to add fillets onto things. Hopefully you've seen that already in some of the things that we've done, and it really does help transform your component design. So wherever possible, I always encourage people to put fillets into sharp corners where those sharp corners aren't necessary. It really does make your design look properly thought out at the end of the day. So one last thing I want to do is, you can see we've got all of these joint flags visible on the part, and that's good because it shows us where we've got joints set up, but I'm pretty happy with the way this is moving. So at this point I'm going to turn the light bulb off for those joints and suppress those flags. That doesn't stop the joint from moving, it just takes those flags out of the workspace. And the reason I've done that is because when we repeat this body 6 times in our main assembly, it's going to look pretty cluttered if we leave all of those flags turned on. So I'm pretty happy now at this stage to save that. This is the final level of leg assembly that I want to take into my main assembly. So how do we do that? I'll switch to the main assembly that we created earlier. So this was that core assembly, and what I need to do is open up the data panel. And there's 2 ways of bringing in that sub-assembly into this core assembly, and that is I can hover over it and right click and choose the option that says insert into current design. So that's the first way. The second way is to actually click on that, left click on that left leg sub-assembly and drag and drop it into the main assembly. So in a couple of seconds that will actually appear, and at this stage now I'm going to minimize the data panel, take that out, and what I can now do is move this roughly around to the sort of position that it needs to be. And I've now done that, and I've actually noticed there's a bit of a problem with this. So when I designed the gap between the upper and lower plates in the core assembly, I created a 50mm spacing. The servo block I made 60mm tall, so there's a bit of an error there and I need to deal with that. I can either extend the distance between the upper and lower plate. I don't want to do that, so what I'm going to do is actually drop down that top surface of the servo by 10mm. So to do that I'm going to go back into my leg sub-assembly, and before we do that I just want to show you a couple of differences in modelling approach that we did earlier and the consequences of that. The first one is the sketches that we created for these linkages, you'll see we created before we created these components. That's resulted in that sketch being left behind, so the linkages have now moved into different positions, but the sketch is remote from where those parts are. And you can contrast that to the leg, where if I turn on the sketches on the leg, those sketches actually follow the leg around. So that's one benefit of actually generating sketches within the component. So when we do activate component and then start sketching, it puts the sketch underneath the component, it carries the sketch around with it, and it's always then easier to find the sketch that's related to a particular component. So it's always good practice wherever possible to create the sketch underneath the component that it actually belongs to. So I'm just going to turn that last sketch off, and what we want to do now is modify the sketch that we used to create that servo block. So I'm going to right click on it in the browser and do an edit sketch, and what I need to do is change that 60mm dimension to 50mm. Before I do that, I've actually got a constraint up here that's actually locking that point in place, and I can remove that constraint by clicking on it so it's highlighted and then hitting delete on the keyboard. That will then allow me to edit that dimension and make that 50 instead of 60, and then that just brings down that top line whilst leaving this bottom line in position. I can now hit stop sketch and it will rebuild the model with that, so it's now 50mm tall and not 60mm. But there's a couple of things that have happened. The first one is I've got this warning down in the timeline that's telling me that I've got an issue with one of the fillets I created. So what I'm going to do there is just take that out of the timeline, so delete that, And the other thing that's happened is I've got this strange bit of geometry going on down at the bottom, so I just need to deal with that. And the best way to do that is click on that fillet and then hit delete, and that's taken that fillet out. And now I'm actually going to modify by extruding that particular face. So I'm going to capture the position and drive that face until it's back up level with that face there. And then I'm going to go to modify and reinsert the fillet on that edge of 2mm. So that's now dealt with those couple of issues that came about from me modifying that sketch. And now I'm happy that that's 50mm tall now, that servo block. So I'm now going to hit save, and that's going to save that version. And now when I go back into my main assembly, you'll notice there's some yellow warning triangles that have appeared. There's a couple in the browser and there's one at the top of the screen. And those yellow triangles are warning you that one of the components in this assembly is out of date. And obviously in this case it's the leg subassembly, because we've just modified that. So to deal with that, I just need to hit that yellow warning triangle and it will update the design with the latest version of that leg subassembly. So those yellow warning triangles have now disappeared, because I've now got the very latest level of this part in my assembly. So now I've actually got something that's going to fit together. I can start doing the assembly work for that. So I'm going to do, first of all, I need to create an assembly around my core, and I'm going to do that as an as-built joint again. So I can literally click the bottom piece and the central core and join those together as a rigid joint, and then go back and create another as-built joint between this top plate and the core. So these are all rigidly joined together now, so they're all moving together. And what I'm going to do is actually ground the bottom base plate. So I'm going to right click and ground that part. So that's now locked in position. I can't move that anymore, but I can still move this leg assembly. And what I'm going to do now is create a joint between this particular feature on the leg assembly, so the top face of that servo block. I'm going to make the center of that hole to the center of this hole in the underside of that base plate. The two are going to move together and do a little rotation. Now what you'll see is that block has become disconnected from the rest of the assembly. Don't worry about that, it's not broken anything. As soon as you click OK, everything snaps back together. And we've now got our first leg assembly imported and connected into our main assembly. And what we can do now is, there's a couple of ways we can drag and drop this in a further 5 times, or we can do a copy and a paste as we did previously and bring a duplicate of that part in. So we've now got another instance of it, and now we can go round and carry on and do another joint and do that a further 4 times after that to create all 6 legs connected into our core assembly. And at that point we will have most of our hexapod complete.